Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Candidates. I'm Danny Vittori, and today we have Essex County Sheriff candidate Virginia Leigh. So thank you for coming on the show.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Danny.
Of course. Now first, could you just tell the voters a little bit about yourself? Take 1 minute.
Sure. So I'm a clinical social worker. I have worked in community mental health for my entire career, which spans all the way about 15 years of working in different community settings, detention centers, community clinics, schools, and ultimately now running for sheriff. I live in Lynn. I've worked in Lynn the last 6 years. Before that, I was working in Brockton, and I've also worked in detention centers both in Massachusetts and in Mexico.
Oh, wow, great. And so what do you believe is the job of the Essex County Sheriff?
Well, so, the job has changed over time, which makes sense that the community at large is oftentimes not very aware of what the job is. So, when this Constitution of the state was established, the job of the sheriff was both the steward of all of the prisoners in the county and also had law enforcement components to it. Because we had no police departments. But as communities grew and cities and towns began to establish their own police departments, all of the law enforcement duties were outsourced to the police departments. So what remains is that the sheriff in Essex County and across the state is the steward of the county jail, the person in charge of rehabilitation, treatment, custody of prisoners who are both awaiting trial and those who are serving lower level sentences for crimes related to primarily substance use, mental health, and crimes of poverty. Ultimately, those folks are coming back into the community, and the job of the sheriff is to ensure that their rehabilitation is successful and that their reentry is a permanent one back into the community. So this is what I believe the job of the sheriff is, and I see that as very much a human services job as the chief rehabilitation officer for our community.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, great. And what are the top 3 issues that you would tackle if elected sheriff?
So the first one is to really evaluate and establish a rigorous program of treatment that assesses the current programming. There are some programs that are being run in the Essex County Sheriff's Department that are successful, and one of which was started in the former Sheriff Cousins era, the Women in Transition program, which has been very successful, largely because of its emphasis on substance use treatment, on clinical treatment and human services staffing in that jail. Now that's a 25-bed unit, so we need to make sure that we're taking the lessons learned in those programs that do work and actually broadening the scope of our impact across our most populated and concentrated population, which is in Middleton Jail. We need to ensure that people are getting access to effective programming that is not only working to help people to transform their lives, but also saving taxpayer dollars when people don't recidivate and find themselves back in the system. The second thing that I want to focus on is really ensuring that all of the policies of the Sheriff's Department are free from conflicts of interest, such as nepotism or complex political relationships that don't necessarily benefit the ultimate goal of the Sheriff's Department as the Chief Rehabilitation Office for the county. We need to make sure that our policies, for example, how prisoners are in connection with their families, need to be in the service of the evidence which suggests that family connectedness reduces recidivism. So as sheriff, I'll abolish the practice of charging large amounts of money to families to remain connected to their family members behind bars. And then finally, we really need to address the mental health and supports that correctional officers receive as well. Correctional officers have very difficult and delicate and oftentimes dangerous jobs working inside of the jail. And we need to make sure that those folks both feel seen and supported and understood by their leadership, but also that they are getting the access to the supports that they need as well. Mental health is something that impacts prisoners, but it also impacts correctional officers. Our suicide rates here in Massachusetts among correctional officers are 12 times higher than that of our general public. And I really believe that suicide and divorce, struggles with substance use and mental health should not be occupational hazards when people are doing a tremendous and important service to our community.
Right, really, that's great. Thank you. And a little off that, but why do you believe that your qualifications and past experience make you the best candidate for sheriff?
So as I mentioned, 90% of what we do in the sheriff's department is social services. It's clinical treatment. It's case management. It's reentry supports. And these are the bread and butter of what clinicians and social workers do all day, every day. I don't just think about those programs as items on a paper to determine whether or not they work or not. I actually know those programs from the inside out because I have had to provide that kind of clinical treatment in my time. So I believe that the best leaders in a system are those who have actually worked with the types of services that are needing to be provided. And in this case, the Sheriff's Department is our largest provider of treatment for substance use and mental health in the county, whether or not we wish to acknowledge that. As a social worker, I am used to meeting people where they're at, not hoping that people are at a different place than they are. And so when I look at the Sheriff's Department and I look at the reality, which is that the vast majority of people who are spending time behind bars are suffering from mental health and substance use disorders, that the direct line of cause and effect to reducing recidivism is getting people the proper treatment. I'm not trying to create an issue that's not there. I'm simply acknowledging and defining what is right here in front of us. And the reason that I feel like I'm the most qualified candidate is because we have examples in other places, but in our state and across the country, when people who have social work backgrounds, human services backgrounds, are elected as sheriff, they lead the country in the innovations, in the state-of-the-art programming that they offer the people under their care. And that's exactly the kind of legacy I hope to continue in my tenure as sheriff.
Thank you. And that's also my place. How would you take your ideas and vision for the sheriff position and make it a reality?
Well, as a clinical social worker, one of the most important skills that we have, clinical social workers are essentially therapists, right? So one of our most important skills is listening. I am a professional listener. So the very first thing I need to do when I get into that job, in the service of accomplishing the longer term vision of putting into place all of my dreams, is to listen to the people who are impacted by the system. And that means listening to staff at every level of the rank system. That means listening to victims of crime, and that means listening to prisoners and people who have spent time inside of our jail, and those who have been on recovery, on the road to recovery for quite some time. I've already been doing that listening tour as I'm on this campaign trail. I've been endorsed by the former assistant superintendent of Middleton Jail, who has indicated and acknowledged how important really changing our culture from one of retribution to one of rehabilitation is necessary. I've been interviewing and talking with victims of crime, with offenders and former offenders and people who've been justice involved. And so the path towards accomplishing the vision effectively of any goals is always listening to all of the parties involved and getting to know the system.
Wow, awesome. Thank you. And what would you say, what are the biggest improvements you would make to the prisons in Essex County?
So we have to acknowledge where we're falling short and be humble about that. Right now, our recidivism rates in the county throughout the vast majority of this current administration's tenure have been at 47%. That's nearly half of the people in this system who are being failed by the department who is in charge of providing their treatment and care and ultimately their successful reentry. We have to improve, and we have to improve quickly, because recidivism is expensive. It's expensive both in terms of future victims that could be prevented if we lowered recidivism, and it's expensive in terms of our taxpayer dollars and our public safety. Every time someone recidivates, every time someone finds themselves re-incarcerated, our taxpayers pay $77,000 a year to house and treat someone inside of our jail system. That is a high number, and it should only be happening once and then never again. We have an overcrowding problem in our jails. We have a high need to provide support to our correctional officers who are understaffed and frankly completely overwhelmed and at a point in their morale that they absolutely need for their sheriff to be showing up for them. And those are two of the things that I would like to do. Improve our recidivism rate as quickly as possible, and also recruit as many new staff inside of our jails, and with the right kinds of expertise and the right mentality about what that job is going to be like for them.
Awesome. Great. And this goes off of that. How do you think we can reduce recidivism?
So we have to provide treatment that is not simply box checking, okay, 25 guys are in the room, great, therapy session's in order, check off your boxes, I'm leaving to go look at the computer, I'm coming back at the end of the session, and that's your treatment for the day, right? We have to have both programming that is dedicated to the evidence of what reduces recidivism. What does accountability look like? What kinds of work does this particular person with this particular constellation of issues need in order to make a plan that is a sustainable and effective plan upon reentry? It also means evaluating the reentry programs that we have. We don't have a lot of evidence for the reentry programs that are currently in place because they only came into place after I pulled papers, right? So we can't have a sheriff who is delaying prioritizing some of these utmost important programming that directly leads to reducing recidivism until there's an election year 6 years down the road. We're going to have our next sheriff until 2029. So Essex County has to decide, what kind of justice system do we want to have in the near decade, right? And we can choose whether that's more of the same with mediocre to minimal to negative results in the worst of cases in Essex County. Or we can choose to put the right leadership in place with the right expertise and make sure that recidivism is being looked at from the data-driven, space of acknowledging the importance of how evidence and staffing impacts recidivism.
Great. And we're already at our final question. So what changes or expansions would you make to the STAR program?
So first and foremost, the STAR program here in Lynn opened its doors in April, 6 years after our sheriff was elected. The first and most important change that I would make to reentry programs in the county, including the STAR program, is to invest in them and prioritize them from the beginning. I also think that it's necessary that we look at programs across the country and right here in our city and county that actually work to help people reenter, and make sure that we are both building partnerships with those programs and also using our resources to increase access for people who may not be touched by those programs just yet. Reentry and aftercare support programs only exist inside of our correctional system because of sheriffs who had clinical or social work or human services experience. We have precedents and legacies that we can build off of, but if we choose a glacial pace of progress where we simply look at what's available and go, mediocrely based on what's there, then we will never get our county to the place where it is being proactive on recidivism, where it's being proactive on our opioid epidemic, where it's re-envisioning what our community safety could look like. So I absolutely want to look into the STAR program as to what's effective, what's not, what's working, but we don't have that data because we haven't actually gotten to have those programs up and running for longer than a season.
So that actually brings us to our last question. So I just want to thank you again for coming on and answering some questions for us, letting the viewers know. So once again, this is Conversations with Candidates. I'm Danny Vittori, and we will see you next time.